Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth.
We're continuing to make our way through Proverbs 31 in our Sacred Marriage segment, and that means I get to begin today by welcoming my wife. Welcome, sweetheart. Don't laugh at me for almost saying something other than wife.
I'm so glad to be here.
Good. I'm glad you're here.
I think you were going to say wool.
Yeah. Well, I have had wool on the mind as we've been going through Proverbs 31.
Yes, you have.
Last time we were together, we looked at verses 13 through 18 that looked specifically at the labors of the virtuous wife in providing for her family. But it doesn't stop there, as we see here in these next two verses. Verse 19 says, "She stretches out her hands to the distaff, and her hand holds the spindle. She extends her hand to the poor. Yes, she reaches out her hands to the needy." Now, I would very much like to just sit back, dear, and just give you the mic and ask you to just go. And we'll see how far you can go, because I know that's not something you particularly want to do. But here's what
I don't like to talk about myself.
Well, I know, but that's okay. Your husband wants you to, so get in line.
I'll follow your lead.
Thank you, baby. What I'm saying is, when I read these words, I think of two things. One, do you notice how 3 times, right, 4 times in these two verses, we have the word hand or hands. And that made me think of how you turned to God and heard God when you yourself were in a needy position. So really what I'm going to ask you to do is talk about that Christmas experience when you were in need and God told you to use
the popcorn. Yes,
and then I want you to sort of segue from there into the ministry that you helped to start and all that. Can you? Okay.
So, 1991, I was divorced for the second time. And in the middle of that divorce, I had 3 small children, one of which had come from that marriage. They were 1, 2, and 5. And I faced a lot of hardship. When I moved out of that marriage, I got into an apartment. I had very little furniture. I had a table my grandmother gave me. I had no beds for the children. I had a bed. And they were very eager, small beginnings. And we were not dependent at that point on the state. I had not tried to seek help from the government. And the Lord told me to use what was in my hands. We were in need of groceries. We were in need of food. And it was winter. And it wasn't my custom to ask for help. And so I said, "Lord, what do I do?" And the Lord said, "Use what's in your hand." And I had a hot air popper that was sitting on the counter. And we had brown bags. And we had 40 brown bags.
Yeah, like the kind that you
paper
use to
bags for lunch.
pack a lunch.
And so we popped 40 bags of popcorn, and there was a neighborhood that development that was behind the apartments where I was raising my children, and you had to cross a darling little bridge and go over the creek to get to it. And it was the dead of winter. There was many inches of snow on the ground. I had to bundle the children up. Jessica held the hand of one of the other children while I carried the other one on my hip, and we went to 40 homes, and we asked to sell popcorn for $1. And we put them in garbage bags and drug them behind us because we had our arms full with the babies. And but out of that resource, you always think you're poor, and there's someone always more poor than you.
Well,
Always more in need
don't
than you.
move on yet. I want to.
There's more to that story.
Well, there is. I want to explore a little bit about how this felt, about how God actually did.
Ask up, buddy?
How God did provide for you in that. Even if you remember the experience of taking that money that you earned and going to the grocery store and getting groceries for your family. I mean, this. I don't want you to. This was an important event.
Well, it was.
Yeah.
I mean, we were in need of food.
Yeah.
And we had just nestled into that apartment, and so I wasn't one that cooked a lot with canned food. We ate fresh food, but you're coming from a marriage that had ended, and you're bringing with you what you can into an apartment. And so, it was just a very rough, cold event. I had to expose my children to dragging them along and being part of, it wasn't like the people that you drive by that hold up a sign that say we're in need of food, and he's got, McDonald's bag sitting behind him and his truck sitting over in the parking lot across the way. And I'm not saying that there aren't people that are needy, but this was us putting ourselves to action and being resourceful with what we had.
And God honoring that, and God speaking to you. This is just a wonderful thing that, for me, if I were in those shoes, I would be scared to death that it's not going to work.
Yeah.
And and thinking, did I hear that right from God? Is this what He means? What if this doesn't work? And
well, there comes a point, honey, where when a person is rescued by God, He's intervening in their lives, and that relationship is there. Mm-hmm. When you have no one to depend on, that's the best place to be.
Yes.
I personally hate that place for so many reasons, because
it's not easy.
It is hard. It's terribly hard. And you don't know if your situation will ever change. You don't know what's going to be there 5 months, 6 months, 5 years. And I look at my life and look back and think, I'm so thankful that I had those very specific situations, because they propelled me and pushed me into God's Word to know that He cared for me and that He wiped every tear that I had. He was so personal. He is so personal. And let me, for any listener there, Isaiah 54 is where God brought me, and I think it's from verses 4 to maybe 7 or maybe 8a. But that was when I completely surrendered my life to God. I'd messed it up. My children were paying for my poor choices in men and all the things. And so regardless of that, God was faithful.
He always is.
And my kids today, Heather and Sarah would not have remembered that. I don't know that Jessica remembers it. She should, probably at 5. But it did lead us into other things, because when God begins to trust you in small things, He begins to enlarge your territory.
Yes, now would be a great time to segue into the rest of the story.
So in 1995...
This is now 4 years later.
Yeah, 4 years later. I was in my last year of college, and I was the college queen. I was Miss Sinclair at Sinclair Community College, and part of one of the duties she had was to create a platform for their Thanksgiving food drive. And that required all of the networking, and basically that position also created platforms for the new Miss Sinclair coming in, and each year it would get expanded. Now today I don't even know if there is such an office with the student government, but then there was. And it was around that time that the Lord told me again, my grandmother, and many people would remember me talking about Grandma Daisy. Grandma Daisy was the oldest of 13 kids, and she was from Kentucky, and she grew up being responsible for all those kids. Uh-huh. And later in life, I would take my kids to her house on Christmas and on Thanksgiving, and she would bring all this food out, and we just had so many leftovers. And I took them because she gave them, but the Lord told me to pack up plates of food and to take them downtown with my children. And
let me stop you right there. Can you remember specifically how that telling happened. Was this a feeling that you had? Was it a voice that you heard?
It was a voice I heard inside.
Okay.
And so we began to pack up the plates of food. I called my brother and said, would you go with us? Because, you're a guy.
Right.
And I didn't want to do it alone, and I didn't know what we would find.
Right.
And we had about 40 plates of food, and we had 3 that had slices of chocolate cake. 3 slices of chocolate cake on these plates. And we couldn't find anybody. And so we went to one of the homeless shelters, and they took our plates of food. And my brother's like, you want to give them all? I said, I just feel like we're supposed to keep the 3 with the chocolate cake.
Okay.
So we handed all those plates of food. And in the downtown Dayton area, what I had found out is that on a holiday, they will allow people to come into the shelters earlier.
Okay.
And so this was probably about 7 or 8 o'clock at night. And they would have already gotten into a shelter at about 4 or 5. So we are leaving downtown Dayton to head back home. And sure enough, there are 3 little African-American children at a bus station in front of a white tower on North Main Street in downtown Dayton. And we just pulled over. And I thought, oh my gosh. And I asked them, would you like some food? There was no adult. There was nobody with them.
Any guess about their ages?
Oh yeah, they were at that time 9, about the ages of my kids.
Uh-huh.
And the daughter, the 9-year-old sister, she was in charge of those kids, and she had wrapped pillowcases around their necks. And she tried to get them warm, and I don't know if they had a bus pass, but they didn't know where their parents were, and she was taking them on the bus to try to go find where the parents were.
Wow.
And my children were ministered to. There were 3 children who had no parents, and I don't even know to this day if they were angels.
Right.
Just God putting those kids there and seeing what 3 children look like with no adult supervision. They ate that food before the bus came. We sat there with them, and they got on the bus, and we got in the car, and I just remember explaining to my children, do you see that these children have no place? They don't even know where their parents are. And just still being able to show my kids God's provision. When I look at the many ways in which God just blessed us, and just unexpected things, somebody paying for our ice cream. We'd gotten scoops of ice cream, and somebody just came up and paid for all of our ice cream at United Dairy Farmers. And I got ready to go pay and realized, oh my gosh, I forgot my purse. And as I realized that the woman at the counter says, did you see that man walk in here and pay for your ice cream? And, God knew. Mm-hmm. And, just when you live a life like that, you begin to learn about faith. You begin to learn in trusting God in hard circumstances. And I was just having a conversation with my girlfriend about that today, saying, you don't want to rescue people. There's a difference with somebody being truly in need and then rescuing someone from being prepared for a miracle or being prepared to learn who God is in their circumstances. And it takes wisdom on both parts.
It does. Now, and out of this came something that grew significantly.
Do you want me to talk about that?
Yeah.
So out of that came the Isaiah 58 project. And it was feeding homeless people on Thanksgiving. And it turned into, originally the name was the Thanksgiving Food Drive, Holiday Food Drive. And every city that we lived in, after I had remarried and we had relocated, it became a citywide event. Mm-hmm. And I would network, as I did in that Miss Sinclair position, with all of the grocers, bakers, all of the businesses that would want to either contribute or be a part of. And we would set up applications in the city or places to receive it so that we knew how much we needed. And it was very well organized. And then last year we did it was here in Fort Wayne, probably the second or third year after we moved here. And it was done at a wonderful Christian bookstore that used to be here called the Anchor Room. And then that was retired because by the time we moved here, Fort Wayne was just so benevolent. There were so many churches and mission-minded people here in Fort Wayne that need really no longer existed. And but the last time that we did that, it was at Black Hawk Christian School, and my kids were there, my older kids, and the school was able to get involved. And it was just such a beautiful thing. I think we had the Gideons involved. We had praise teams there. It grew from just a mom and her 3 little children to a citywide movement.
But going full circle,
Okay.
you have continued the small version.
Okay.
Taking food out and looking for those who are in positions of need. You've done that recently.
Okay.
This is not something that just ebbs and flows. This is
a constant.
And this is what's described here in this virtuous woman. This is who she is. It's not that she extended her hand to the poor once. It's what she does. It's who she is. And so it's just been such a blessing to me to watch you be that woman. And I'm grateful. And I look forward to continuing our conversation as we continue through this proverb. And as always, sweetheart, your husband loves you.
I love you too.
There has come in recent years into the parlance of those of us who tend to be more conservative, and more particularly those within the conservative world who tend to leave room for conspiracy theories, somewhat unusual phrases like false flag or wag the dog. You know, I used to do a regular segment in which I tried to unpack theological Latin terms for folks so that they would know when people are using them for shorthand what they mean. Well, here we're doing the same thing politically. I want to focus not so much on false flag. That is a simple term that means an operation wherein the people purported to be doing the bad thing are actually the supposed ones that are being acted against. It would be a false flag operation, for instance, if operatives from the FBI or other organizations within the federal government actually led what happened on January 6th. That's a false flag operation. Wag the dog is... Well, it comes from that phrase that, don't let the tail wag the dog. You want the dog to wag the tail. And what it means is when we are trying to distract the watching world from story A by giving them stuff on story B. There are all sorts of nuances that spin doctors know how to operate in order to manage the news. One of them is when you drop your story. If you drop your story on a slow news Friday, then it'll get picked up and no one's paying attention anyway, and it'll be forgotten by Monday. That's manipulating the news cycle. But wag the dog is, again, sort of a bigger job. There's actually, I don't know if it's called Wag the Dog, but there was a movie about a president who created a fake war in order to distract. It's sort of, I think it might have been loosely based on Clinton. And I don't remember its name, but nevertheless, the reason I bring that up is because we have had these balloons that have been in the news. We have been seen the potential beginning of World War III grabbing the headlines. We have had various and sundry leaks about COVID-19 and the government sort of changing its position on these things. And it struck me that, my stars, we haven't heard anything in quite a while about the Biden papers. What happened to that story? It has fallen completely off the news radar. You remember we had all the struggle and tussle about President Trump having classified papers at Mar-a-Lago. We had Vice President Pence having some papers, and there was a lot of finger wagging at the Republicans for doing this. And then all of a sudden we had a treasure trove of classified documents in the garage at the house, where not only did President Biden's classic Corvette live, but where his son Hunter Biden lived as well, paying $20,000 a month in rent. This was ramping up to be the full and final expose, not only of Hunter Biden, but of his connections with his father and his father's connection with business interests overseas in China and in Russia. And it's gone. I mean, this was, on the face of it, again, I'm not saying that I know what happened or what would happen if this was all thoroughly looked into, but this was, on its face, potentially the greatest scandal in the history of the United States presidency. If it's true that the president worked together with his son with some sweetheart deals with foreign powers who are at enmity with us, adversaries of us, and that connected to that were classified documents that were not where they should be, and all of it connected to the Hunter Biden laptop. Well, this makes Watergate and the later cover-up look like a walk in the park. Where did it go? And where, friends, are Woodward and Bernstein looking into this and revealing this? I hope that it comes back. I hope that people will remember. I hope that something, some genuine investigation will be done. It's hard to keep track of all this stuff. But this is the mother of them all. Now, the lesson for us, friends, is we need to learn to not be led around by the nose by the mainstream media. We don't need to allow them to set our agenda, to let us be wagged the dogged, if you will. They may try to distract us over here, but we need to stay on the story. So pay attention, be careful, and let's try to wait patiently and see what happens. Earlier today, I finished a blog piece, which I believe will probably be up before this podcast is out. So if you'd like to take a look at it, you can find it at rcsprouljr.com, rcsprouljr.com. And in that piece, it's titled, Queer is as Queer Does. And in it, I talked about how essential to the homosexual movement is the overt and shocking perversion that it celebrates. Not just, as if this weren't enough, the shocking sexual acts that go on in private, but the public displays, the pride parades, the drag shows before children. These things are all part and parcel of the essence of this homosexual movement, that it is intended to be against God's established order of things. We'll also be talking about that tonight, I think, in our Romans Bible study, or soon anyway. It's dealt with in Romans chapter 1. But we right now are in our In the Beginning segment, and we come now to God's giving the sign of the covenant with Noah to Noah and his sons. He establishes the sign, the assurance, the sign of the covenant, that he will not destroy all the earth with a flood again, with what? The establishment of the rainbow. Here's how God puts it. And it's verse 12. And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. I set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. It shall be, when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the rainbow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. The water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. The rainbow shall be in the cloud, and I will look on it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." And God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." Wow. If you remember, we've been talking about how God's interactions with Noah are reflective of his authority and rule over all of mankind, including those who were not believers. And here it is again. God established a covenant with all mankind that he would not destroy the world with a flood, and he gave a sign to all mankind that he would not do this, the rainbow. Now, I'm not sure how far back this goes, probably back to the Greeks if I had to guess, but some point back in hazy history, scientists were able to figure out the nature of the rainbow and the refraction of sunlight and how it causes these colors to appear in the sky. Unfortunately, we have allowed that truth to somehow undo what's happening here. We think the rainbow is just something natural. I'm not disputing that it is something natural, but I want to affirm that it's God's nature in the first place. That God did this. And now we have the rainbow symbol itself being co-opted by those who are, again, in rebellion against God's natural order of things. Now, I want you to learn, I don't have much time. Very quickly, a part of what God's promise is here is that he will establish order to the created order, that he will have signs and seasons, that winter will be followed by spring, which will be followed by summer, which will be followed by fall. All of this is the public affirmation of a principle that is essential to the work of all science. And that is the principle that the future will be much like the past, that you can predict future events based on past events. That's not a natural, immediate, necessary given. It's only necessary if God says so. And here he says so. The entire structure of all of our scientific knowledge is built on this promise of God. And so you need to understand that science in rebellion against this God is deeply connected with sexuality in rebellion against God, as we see in the homosexual movement. It's not a mistake. But friends, we're not just the world. We're God's people. And as God's people, our calling is to believe God's word. And so I'm asking that I think it's a very healthy thing when Christians look to that rainbow and not just think how pretty, not just think how marvelous, but to think about God's promise, to remember that promise, and to know that promise stands even to this day. The God we serve is the promise keeper. And every time we see that rainbow, we can remember and give thanks. My parents were seated in the left field bleachers at Forbes Field in October 1960 on the occasion of the ninth inning game-winning walk-off home run by Bill Mazeroski, by which the Pittsburgh Pirates defeated the New York Yankees to win the World Series. This is probably the most iconic moment in the history, certainly of Pirates baseball, if not all of baseball. A ninth inning, Game 7 walk-off home run. I mention all that to point out that, my parents, particularly my father, had a deep love for the sport of baseball, as did I growing up. But our experience was radically different. I remember my father saying to me, he said this, he said, I knew baseball was dead the day I went to the ball field and watched as Rennie Stennett walked out to second base between innings, dribbling the baseball. Now, if you are a baseball fan and have any snow on your roof or are bald like me, you may remember Rennie Stennett. He was a very strong hitting second baseman that played for the Pittsburgh Pirates, number 6 on your scorecard. But what's this about dribbling a baseball? Well, see, when I started watching baseball, which would have been 1971. By the way, the Pirates won the World Series that year as well. 1971, I started watching baseball, and the Pirates, the year before, had moved out of Forbes Field, where Bill Mazeroski had hit his home run, and into the brand new Three Rivers Stadium. And Three Rivers Stadium, unlike Forbes Field, was what we call a concrete bowl. This was a very common thing in the 70s, a pattern or style of stadium that was typically designed to house both a baseball and a football team, as Three Rivers did. It was typically circular and typically had artificial turf. Cincinnati's Riverfront Stadium was very similar. Busch Stadium in St. Louis was very similar. I'm sure there are more that I could think of if I spent my time doing so. But that was where I started. And in addition to that change of stadium and change of what they played baseball on, they also had a great change in what they played baseball in. It was around this time that the Pirates and many other teams, if not all other teams, sort of moved away from the more loose-fitting cotton button-up jerseys and baseball pants to the polyester, stretchy kind of pants. That's what I started watching. But that's not always the way it was. That's not what my dad experienced. I watched baseball in the 70s became almost like a live video game. By changing to artificial turf from grass, you all of a sudden had weird hops. You had non-weird hops. That is, you had weird hops in that the ground had more give, and so high bounces were more apt to happen. You could hit a high bouncer at the third and beat it out to first base. But also non-weird hops in the sense that because it was artificial turf, there were no rocks or clumps of grass or something that could give a weird kick to a baseball. So everything was very smooth. Everything was very sort of Logan's Run, science fiction kind of life. And that's sort of what my dad was describing as the reason Randy Stanton could dribble the baseball is because of the artificial turf. It was around this same time that sacrilege came into Major League Baseball, but thankfully in the Junior League, which is the American League that brought in the designated hitter. Oh, man. Oh, man. Well, now, even that's a funny thing. I'm sounding like a purist. I'm watching right now in our day as there's uproar over the pitch clock and also demand for the pitch clock and all sorts of weaknesses and struggles that baseball is dealing with. But I loved that. It looked fancy. It looked fast. It looked clean. By the way, the Reds not only had the same kind of stadium, they had the same kind of uniform, and that was the era of the Big Red Machine. They were our big rival, and we tended to duke it out to represent the National League in the World Series when I was a kid. Not exclusively, but that's one of the things that happened. Nowadays, gosh, it's so different. It is so different. Nowadays, they try to entertain you every spare second at the stadium. It wasn't a slow passing of time kind of experience. Once you have, people shooting T-shirts into the stadium or, sausages racing around the stadium to see who wins a prize, that kind of nonsense, that's not baseball. Well, I'm getting to be an old baseball curmudgeon, and the reality is I don't pay much attention anymore. Some of the magic has gone. That said, I'm still grateful for anything that recaptures that magic, like actually seeing a game. It's coming up. Baseball season's starting soon. I hope that it still has the magic. Last week, if you'll recall, we talked about our propensity to treat the Bible as a living document, which means we can kill off parts of it that we determine are culturally bound. I spoke against that perspective, but Someone might object back and say, well, now wait a minute. What about head coverings? And looking at that text, they might also wonder, well, what does because of the angels mean? Well, let me tell you about head coverings. I'm for them. And I have just a few thoughts on the matter. First, I am more than happy to concede that men of good will differ on this issue. That said, I'm also delighted that one person who shared my perspective was my father. That, of course, doesn't settle the issue. It does, however, help my own confidence that I'm not out in left field. Second, I'm also happy to boldly suggest that virtually every Christian from the time of Paul's epistle to about a half a century ago agrees with me on this issue. That also doesn't ultimately settle the issue, but it helps my confidence even more that I'm not out in left field. What potent interpretive insight, I wonder, did the church miss for all those centuries? Isn't it just a bit curious that all believers believe the same thing on this issue until the rise of feminism? Third, one thing I'm certain of, having our wives cover their heads at corporate worship is certainly not a sin. Looking down our noses at those who do not do so is a sin. Doing so is certainly not. Failing to do so, on the other hand, may be a sin. By resistless Pascalian logic, the choice should be obvious. That is, if choice A is certainly not a sin, and choice B possibly could be a sin, isn't it clearly safer and better to choose A? Fourth, I'm highly skeptical of the her hair is the covering argument. It strikes me that if that were the case, Paul wouldn't have had to say anything. As messed up as the Corinthian church was, I don't suspect that there was a strong husbands with bald-headed wives contingent there that needed to be rebuked. Such is not to say I understand precisely where the long hair fits in all of this. Fifth, please notice the grammar I used earlier. This is an issue for husbands, not wives. That is, no man will be able to stand before the throne of God, and when he asks why his wife worshipped uncovered, say, yeah, what about that? Why don't we get her in here? Wives, that means that if your husband doesn't want you to cover, covering is a sin. We are to obey those in authority over us unless or until they command us to do what God clearly forbids, or forbid us to do what God clearly commands. I don't believe this is an issue that rises to the level of clearly. It would, I suspect, give the devil quite a laugh if a woman covers her head as a sign of submission to a husband who asked her not to. Sixth, I really don't like to make a big deal about this. When I'm asked in person about this issue, I typically reply, I'll probably commit a more grave sin in the time it takes me to answer the question than it is to be wrong on this issue. It would never cross my mind to think less of any family with a wife's head uncovered. So why did I bother to answer it? So I could get to the second part of the question. Here, I have what may be the wisest answer I could ever give. What is meant by because of the angels? I don't know.
You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com and join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.